The world was ending at 5:50 on the morning of June 6th, 1944. For the German soldiers of the Heer's 352nd Infantry Division garrisoning the battery at Pointe du Hoc, this was not a surprise. It was the terrifying, thunderous fulfillment of a prophecy they had lived with for months. From inside the damp, cold concrete of the observation bunker, the very air vibrated, the ground shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling with each fresh detonation. The noise was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that hammered against the skull and made thought impossible. This was the invasion. This was the long-dreaded storm breaking upon the shores of Fortress Europe. The men huddled inside were veterans, many from the brutal Eastern Front, and they knew the calculus of modern warfare. First came the bombers, then the naval guns, a symphony of high explosives designed to pulverize, to terrorize, to soften the defenses before the real attack began. And the orchestra playing this morning was a masterpiece of destruction. Looking through the narrow observation slit, they could see the impossible armada stretched out across the grey, choppy waters of the English Channel. Hundreds, no, thousands of ships dotted the horizon, their guns flashing in the pre-dawn gloom like a man-made lightning storm. The American battleship USS Texas was out there, its 14-inch guns hurling shells the size of a man across the miles, each one screaming through the air before impacting with the force of a locomotive. The defenders felt a grim, familiar fear, but also a sense of validation. This was war as they understood it. This was the material might of America they had been warned about. A nation that buried its enemies under a mountain of steel. They were prepared for this. The bunkers were thick. The machine gun nests were perfectly sited to sweep the beaches to their left and right, Omaha and Utah. The cliffs themselves, rising a sheer 100 feet from the churning sea, were the greatest defense of all. No sane commander would even consider a frontal assault here. It was a granite wall, a natural fortress no army could scale. They just had to ride out the storm of steel. Then, as the bombardment lifted, shifting its focus further inland, a strange quiet descended, broken only by the hiss of the sea and the distant crump of explosions. A young lieutenant, his face pale with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, pressed his binoculars to the observation slit, scanning the waves below. He saw the landing craft, the Higgins boats, churning towards the beaches far to the east and west, just as predicted. But then he saw something else. Something that didn't make sense. Directly below them, at the base of the sheer cliffs, several of the small boats were heading directly for the shore. He watched, confused, as they slammed into the narrow strip of rocky beach. What were they doing? It was suicide. A trick? A diversion? He adjusted the focus on his binoculars, his knuckles white, and then he saw it. A rocket fired from one of the craft, trailing a rope. Then another, and another. Grappling hooks, attached to thick, wet ropes, shot upwards, arcing towards the cliff top. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was impossible. A desperate, insane gesture. He felt a bark of laughter catch in his throat, a laugh of pure disbelief. They were going to try and climb? Here? Under the barrels of their guns? The men next to him crowded the slit, squinting into the morning light. Their expressions mirrored his own. Confusion, followed by a dark, almost comical sense of superiority. They were sending boys on a fool's errand. The lieutenant lowered his binoculars, a cold knot tightening in his stomach that had nothing to do with the naval bombardment. The sheer audacity of it was staggering, and for the first time that morning, a new kind of fear, cold and unfamiliar, began to creep in, the fear of the unknown. To understand the depth of that German lieutenant's shock, to grasp why the sight of ropes and grappling hooks was more terrifying than the firestorm from an entire naval fleet, one must understand the world constructed by Nazi propaganda. The German soldier, particularly the veteran of the Russian front, was conditioned to see himself as the pinnacle of martial virtue. He was hardened, ideologically pure, a product of a Spartan society dedicated to struggle and victory. He had faced the Soviet horde, a numerically superior, but, in his eyes, subhuman enemy, and had fought them to a standstill through sheer German will and superior tactics. The enemy he was taught to expect from the West was entirely different, but no less contemptible. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had for years painted a vivid picture of the American people. and by extension, their soldiers. Americans were not warriors. They were a decadent, mongrelized society of jazz musicians, gangsters, and stock market gamblers. They were soft, accustomed to luxury and comfort, their bodies weakened by rich food, and their minds rotted by Hollywood fantasies and Jewish-controlled media. Their strength was not in their blood or their spirit, but in their factories. They were a nation of assembly lines, capable of producing endless tanks, planes, and ships, but utterly incapable of producing true soldiers. The American GI was portrayed as an unwilling conscript, a boy torn from his drugstore counter or his movie palace, given a uniform and a rifle and sent to die for the interests of international finance. Propaganda newsreels shown to troops in France would feature clips of American prisoners of war, often looking young, bewildered, and terrified. The commentary would be scornful. See these boys? Their faces show no conviction, no understanding of the cause for which they are meant to die. They fight for Coca-Cola and Hollywood films. The German High Command knew, of course, that American industrial power was a serious threat, but the pervasive belief, drilled down through every level of the Wehrmacht, was that this industrial might was a crutch. The Americans, they were told, would rely on overwhelming, impersonal firepower to solve every tactical problem. They would bomb cities into rubble from 5 miles up. They would smother trench lines with artillery. They would advance behind a wall of Sherman tanks, but they could not match the German soldier in a direct, man-to-man contest of courage, skill, and fortitude. They would attack where the ground was easy, where their machines could do the fighting for them. The idea that Americans would choose the hardest possible path, that they would attempt a feat of arms requiring immense individual bravery, discipline, and physical prowess, simply did not compute. It flew in the face of everything they had been taught. They were stunned to realize that the enemy possessed a will equal to their own, because their entire worldview was predicated on the idea that this was impossible. They had laughed at the notion that such a pampered society could produce men capable of scaling a 100-foot cliff under a hail of machine gun fire, until now. This unexpected display of elite capability was not an accident. It was the physical manifestation of a core tenet of the American military philosophy that German intelligence fundamentally misunderstood. While America did indeed lean on its unparalleled industrial base, its military planners understood that machines alone could not seize and hold ground. They knew that certain objectives, certain linchpins in the enemy's defense, would require not a sledgehammer, but a scalpel. This led to the creation of specialized units, born from a uniquely American spirit of problem-solving and individual initiative. The United States Army Rangers were the epitome of this doctrine. Activated in 1942 and modeled on the famed British Commandos, the Rangers were an all-volunteer force, men who actively sought out the most dangerous missions. Their training was a brutal crucible designed to forge soldiers who were not only physically tougher and more skilled than their regular army counterparts, but who were also mentally conditioned to operate independently and to innovate under fire. The man selected to lead the Provisional Ranger Force for D-Day, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, was a Texas football coach, not a West Point aristocrat. He embodied the practical, no-nonsense, get-it-done attitude that defined the unit. The mission given to his 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions was deemed critical to the success of the entire invasion. The German 155mm gun battery at Pointe du Hoc was perfectly positioned to rain devastating fire down upon both the Omaha and Utah landing beaches. Allied planners concluded that if those guns were not silenced, the casualties on the beaches could become so catastrophic as to threaten the entire lodgment. The problem was the battery's location. It sat atop a sheer, unscalable cliff, a seemingly impenetrable fortress. The American solution was not to level it with bombs, which had already failed, nor to bypass it. The solution was to do the impossible. It was to send 225 men to scale that cliff using ropes, grappling hooks, and sectional ladders under fire and destroy the guns. This was a plan so audacious that it bordered on suicidal, but it was rooted in the American belief that with the right training, the right equipment, and the right kind of men, nothing was truly impossible. They trained for months on the cliffs of the Isle of Wight, perfecting the techniques they would use. They developed specialized equipment, including rocket-propelled grappling hooks fired from landing craft. This wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a highly specialized, meticulously planned operation that relied entirely on the skill and courage of the individual soldier. The German defenders never knew this side of the American military existed. They saw the endless river of Sherman tanks and jeeps and understood it as a triumph of the factory. What they were about to witness at Pointe du Hoc was something entirely different. It was a triumph of the human spirit, a demonstration that the nation of factories could also produce warriors of the highest caliber, a shocking revelation that would shatter their illusions and mark the beginning of the end. The German lieutenant, a man named Johannes Schmidt, who had earned his Iron Cross freezing in the snows outside Stalingrad, regained his composure. The initial shock gave way to the cold professionalism of a combat officer. This was not an act of tactical genius. It was an act of mass suicide, and he would be its executioner. He began shouting orders, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter of his men. Machine guns, the feared MG-42 seconds, were swiveled into position, their heavy barrels pointing down towards the cliff edge. Grenadiers pulled the porcelain beads on their steel hand granaton, the potato masher grenades, preparing to rain them down on the climbers. From their vantage point, it was the perfect killing field. The Americans would be completely exposed on the ropes, unable to maneuver, unable to effectively fight back. It would be a slaughter. Schmidt felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He would teach these arrogant drugstore cowboys a lesson in real war. The first ropes snaked over the edge, the grappling hooks catching in the shell-pocked earth. The men laughed at the sight. It was almost pathetic. Below, tiny figures in green began their ascent. The order was given. The air tore apart with the sound of the MG-42 seconds, a sound like ripping canvas, firing at an astonishing 1,200 rounds per minute. Streams of tracer rounds poured down the cliff face, chipping away at the rock, seeking flesh. Grenades were tossed over the edge, tumbling down before exploding in bright flashes of orange and black smoke. Schmidt watched through his binoculars, expecting to see the ropes go slack, to see bodies plummeting into the churning waves below. He expected screams, panic, a full-scale retreat. For a few moments, that seemed to be what was happening. He saw men fall. He saw ropes severed by the concentrated fire. But then he saw something that made the blood run cold in his veins. The others kept climbing. Not only did they keep climbing, but they were fighting back. While hanging from a rope, 100 feet in the air, with a storm of steel raining down on them, they were firing their rifles. Upwards. It was a physical impossibility. How could a man hold on to a wet, swaying rope with one hand and accurately fire a garrisoned rifle with the other? Yet he saw it. Puffs of dust and rock exploded from the cliff face near his own men as the American bullets found their mark. One of his machine gunners cried out and slumped over his weapon, a neat hole drilled through his helmet. Another grenadier screamed and clutched his shoulder, dropping his grenade, which rolled harmlessly away. Schmidt couldn't believe his eyes. This wasn't the behavior of soft, unwilling conscripts. This was the work of demons. The climbers were using the contours of the cliff face for cover, swinging on the ropes to avoid the streams of fire, coordinating their movements with a terrifying efficiency. The shock came not as a single, deafening blast, but as a cascade of impossible moments. The Germans were stunned to realize their perfect defensive position was being systematically dismantled by an enemy that was, for all intents and purposes, hanging in mid-air. The primary tactic of the defenders was simple: cut the ropes. Men with bayonets and e-tools ran to the edge, hacking at the thick, wet hemp. But for every rope they managed to sever, sending the men on it to their deaths, another two seemed to take its place. And now, the American warships offshore had noticed the struggle. The destroyers USS Satterlee and USS McCook moved in, dangerously close to the shore, and began to fire their 5-inch guns directly at the cliff-top fortifications. The shells came in flat and fast, screaming overhead and exploding with pinpoint accuracy on the German machine gun nests. Concrete, earth, and men were thrown into the air. The world dissolved into a chaotic hell of noise, smoke, and flying shrapnel. Schmidt was thrown from his feet by a nearby explosion, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. When he pushed himself up, the scene had changed from a controlled execution to a desperate, close-quarters brawl. The first American Ranger had appeared over the edge of the cliff. He wasn't a boy. He was a man. His face smeared with black camouflage paint, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying resolve. He didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to catch his breath. He simply rolled over the edge, brought his Thompson submachine gun to bear, and fired a long, sustained burst that stitched across a German gun crew. Other heads began to appear. One after another, the Rangers crested the cliff. They were like spectres rising from the sea, their movements economical and deadly. They weren't an army, they were a hunting party, and the Germans were their prey. Schmidt fumbled for his MP-40 submachine gun, his mind struggling to process the sheer speed of the collapse. His men were shouting, confused, falling back from the cliff edge, firing wildly into the smoke. The carefully prepared defensive lines, the interlocking fields of fire, were now useless. The enemy was inside. They were among them. The propaganda image of the soft, clumsy American soldier shattered into a million pieces, replaced by the terrifying reality of the grim-faced man in the green helmet, who was now charging directly at him through the cratered moonscape of the battery. In the immediate aftermath, there was no stunned silence. There was only the cacophony of battle. But underneath the roar of guns and the screams of the wounded, a profound, world-altering silence was descending upon the German defenders' psyche. Their certainty was gone. Their belief in their own inherent superiority was being shot to pieces alongside their comrades. For men like Lieutenant Schmidt, this was more than just a tactical reversal. It was an ideological crisis. They had fought Russians who came in waves, driven by commissars, but they had never faced an enemy who displayed this combination of individual skill and unbreakable courage. The Rangers moved with a terrifying synergy, one team laying down, covering fire while another advanced, clearing trenches and bunkers with grenades and bayonets. They were outnumbered, having lost many men on the climb and in the initial assault, but they fought with the ferocity of an army twice their size. The German defenders, who had been prepared to sit behind their machine guns and mow down an enemy attacking across open ground, were now forced into a brutal, intimate fight they never expected. They were shocked to find themselves outmaneuvered and outfought in the very trenches they had dug. They had trained for years to be the ultimate soldiers, yet here, on this desolate piece of French coastline, they met men who were their equals and perhaps their betters. As Schmidt scrambled for cover in a shell crater, firing a desperate burst from his weapon, he caught the eye of a young private, no older than 17. The boy's face was a mask of pure terror and disbelief. All the stories, all the training, all the assurances of their own invincibility had evaporated in less than 30 minutes. They had laughed at the enemy, and now the enemy was standing over them, casting a long shadow from the edge of the world. Their carefully constructed reality had cracked, and through that crack they saw the terrifying, unstoppable face of a new American warrior they never knew existed. The bloody fight for the gun battery at Pointe du Hoc was not a freak occurrence. A singular moment of reckless heroism that German military historians could later dismiss as an anomaly. It was, in fact, a perfect and terrifying microcosm of a new American way of war that was now being unleashed all across Normandy. It was a system, a horrifyingly effective system that fused two concepts the German High Command had believed to be mutually exclusive: overwhelming industrial might and supreme individual initiative. The German war machine was a rigid, top-down hierarchy built for decisive, centrally planned battles. It understood the logic of the sledgehammer, the massed panzer division, the concentrated artillery barrage. What it was utterly unprepared for was an enemy who could wield 1,000 scalpels at the same time as the sledgehammer. They were stunned to realize that the American strategy was not an either divided by or proposition. The same nation that could darken the skies with thousands of bombers and fill the seas with warships could also produce small, independent groups of men who could identify a critical objective and achieve it with terrifying autonomy. The Rangers on the cliff were the embodiment of this new reality. They were delivered to their objective by the largest amphibious force in history, the product of industry, but their success depended entirely on the courage, skill, and independent decision-making of each individual man on a rope. This hybrid warfare, this seamless blend of mass and precision, was a strategic puzzle the Wehrmacht would never solve. Pointe du Hoc was merely the opening lesson in a brutal education that would unfold in the fields, hedgerows, and villages of France. The shock that began on that clifftop was about to become the new, grim norm for every German soldier on the Western Front. While the Rangers were scaling the cliffs, another, far more widespread shock was taking place just a few miles inland. German commanders in the rear echelons, responsible for coordinating the defense of the Cotentin Peninsula, began receiving a flurry of bewildering and contradictory reports. Communications were being cut. Small supply convoys were being ambushed on roads that should have been perfectly safe. Bridges were being blown. The reports spoke of American soldiers, but they were appearing in places where no soldiers should be deep behind the front lines, scattered in small pockets, seemingly without cohesion or a clear objective. The German officers, trained in a doctrine that prized order and concentration of force, initially laughed this off as a catastrophic failure of the Allied airborne assault. They knew the Americans had planned a massive drop of 2 airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, to secure key causeways and river crossings behind Utah Beach. From the German perspective, looking at their tactical maps, the drop had been a complete disaster. Instead of landing in concentrated groups on their designated drop zones, the C-47 transport planes, flying through thick cloud cover and heavy anti-aircraft fire, had scattered the paratroopers all across the Norman countryside. Men were dropped into swamps, into flooded fields, and miles away from their units. To the German command, this was a gift. A disorganized, fragmented enemy was an enemy that could be mopped up with ease. They began dispatching patrols and armored units to hunt down these isolated pockets of American paratroopers. But they never knew that this chaos was, in itself, the Americans' most potent weapon. They couldn't believe that what they were seeing as a failure was, in practice, a stunning success. The American paratrooper was a different breed of soldier. He had been deliberately trained to fight alone. Every man, from the private to the colonel, knew the overall mission objective. He was equipped with a map, a compass, a cricket clicker for identification, and the ingrained initiative to cause as much damage as possible, regardless of whether he found his unit. So instead of one large, predictable target, the Germans were faced with hundreds of tiny, unpredictable ones. A single paratrooper would snipe at a staff car from a church steeple. 2 more would mine a crucial crossroads. A small squad, cobbled together from different units who found each other in the dark, would assault a German artillery battery. The effect was strategic paralysis. German reinforcements trying to move towards the beaches were caught in a web of countless small-scale ambushes. Commanders couldn't get a clear picture of the enemy's strength or location because the enemy was, in fact, everywhere and nowhere at once. The German soldier, accustomed to a clear and visible front line, was now terrified of every shadow, every hedgerow. The soft click-clack of a toy cricket in the night became a sound more terrifying than an artillery shell because it signaled the presence of an enemy who operated by a set of rules they simply did not understand. This systemic shock wasn't confined to elite combat units. As the summer wore on and the Allies broke out of the Normandy hedgerow country, the German army began a long fighting retreat across France. And it was here that they encountered the third pillar of this new American reality, a logistical miracle that defied all military logic. German doctrine, built on the Blitzkrieg, understood that the advance of any army was governed by the iron laws of supply. An armoured division could only advance as fast and as far as its fuel and ammunition trucks could follow. The Germans themselves had often been forced to halt successful offensives to allow their logistical tail to catch up. As Patton's Third Army raced across France at a speed that stunned the world, German high command watched with a sense of grim, professional anticipation. They knew it couldn't last. The Allied supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, still dependent on the Normandy beaches, hundreds of miles away. Any day now, Patton's tanks would grind to a halt, their fuel tanks empty. It was inevitable. It was the fundamental rule of warfare. But the halt never came. German reconnaissance pilots flying over the roads of France at night returned with unbelievable reports. They described endless, unbroken columns of American trucks, stretching from horizon to horizon, driving bumper to bumper, two massive, one-way loops of traffic running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They weren't even driving with blackout lights. Their headlights cut blazing trails through the darkness, a defiant display of air supremacy and industrial confidence. This was the Red Ball Express. It was a logistics operation on a scale the world had never seen, an improvised system that mobilized nearly 6,000 trucks, driven primarily by African American soldiers of the Transportation Corps, to haul over 12,000 tons of supplies to the front every single day. The German generals in their headquarters were shocked. They had calculated the Allies' logistical capacity based on traditional models. They never knew that the Americans would simply treat a supply problem like a factory assembly line, applying industrial management principles to the battlefield. The constant, unending rumble of those GMC trucks became a symbol of doom. It was the sound of an enemy that did not need to rest, an enemy whose spearhead was directly connected to the infinite resources of the Detroit factory floor. It was a war not just of soldiers, but of systems, and the German soldier on the ground, short on fuel, on ammunition, on food, could only listen to that distant rumble and understand the profound, hopeless nature of his situation. The American ranger on the cliff, the paratrooper in the dark, and the truck driver on the midnight road, they were all connected. They were the interlocking parts of a single, relentless machine, a new reality of warfare that was turning the European continent into a grave for the Third Reich. In the chateaux and command bunkers of occupied France, the German high command struggled to reconcile the reports flooding in from the front with their established understanding of the enemy. The initial reaction to the Normandy landings was one of almost arrogant confidence. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, and the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, had long disagreed on the best way to defeat the invasion, but they were united in their contempt for the American soldiers' fighting ability. They saw the D-Day plan, with its audacious cliff assaults and scattered airborne drops, as a display of amateurish desperation, a plan so complex and fraught with risk that it was bound to fail. Their professional judgment told them the Americans were overreaching, violating the core principles of military concentration and command. But as June 6th bled into June 7th and beyond, the operational maps on their tables told a different, terrifying story. Pointe du Hoc, initially dismissed as a costly sideshow, was reported as neutralized. The scattered paratroopers, far from being annihilated, had successfully prevented German armored reserves, most critically the 21st Panzer Division, from reaching Omaha and Utah beaches in the crucial first hours. The beachheads, which were supposed to have been thrown back into the sea, were holding and expanding. The official realization within OKW was a slow, agonizing process, a death by 1,000 cuts to their professional pride. They read after-action reports from field commanders that spoke of the enemy in language they couldn't believe. They heard of Rangers who, after taking the cliffs, held out for 2 days against overwhelming counterattacks, their numbers dwindling from over 225 to just 90 effective men, yet refusing to yield. They read accounts of isolated paratroopers who held vital crossroads against German battle groups 10 times their size. The High Command was stunned. This was not the enemy they had planned for. Their entire defensive strategy for France, the much-vaunted Atlantic Wall, was predicated on a brittle, decisive defense at the water's edge. It was designed to shatter a clumsy, predictable assault. It was completely unprepared for an enemy who embraced chaos, who could flow like water through the cracks in their fortress, and who possessed a seemingly limitless supply of men who fought with the skill and ferocity of elite stormtroopers. Rommel, a brilliant and pragmatic commander, was one of the first to grasp the horrifying truth. He recognized that America had not just brought its industrial might to the shores of France, it had brought a new philosophy of war, and his own army had no answer to it. The German response was a series of desperate, reactionary countermeasures that consistently underestimated the depth and systemic nature of the American threat. To counter the elite Allied units, they tried to fight fire with fire. Experienced German units, like the battle-hardened Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers and various Panzer Grenadier divisions were rushed to Normandy. The German Fallschirmjäger were, man for man, arguably among the best soldiers in the world. They expected to make short work of their American counterparts. But when they clashed in the nightmarish close-quarters fighting of the Normandy hedgerows, they were shocked. The American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st were not only their equals in tenacity, but were often better equipped for that specific type of warfare. The Americans had the M1 Garand, a superior semi-automatic rifle that gave them a significant firepower advantage over the bolt-action Kar-98K used by most Germans. They had bazookas in great numbers, turning every hedgerow corner into a potential tank ambush. The Germans found that for every elite unit they committed to a firefight in one sector, another American force would pop up and exploit a weakness somewhere else. They were trying to plug a dam that was springing hundreds of leaks at once. Their attempts to hunt down and destroy the scattered airborne units devolved into a meat grinder. German patrols sent into the Bocage country would simply vanish, picked apart by unseen snipers and well-laid ambushes. The American paratroopers had turned the entire countryside into a lethal maze for the Wehrmacht. It was a war of shadows and whispers, and it broke the nerve of units that had stood firm on the vast, open steppes of Russia. The most telling failure, however, was their inability to counter the American logistical machine. The Luftwaffe, a mere ghost of its former glory, was tasked with interdicting the supply lines. But it was a hopeless mission. Allied fighter bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, owned the skies over France. They were so dominant that German troops took to calling them Jabos, a slang term for fighter bomber, spoken with a mixture of hatred and terror. A German pilot who managed to take off was lucky to survive his own climb to altitude, let alone find and attack the Red Ball Express. The endless columns of trucks drove on, practically unmolested. The German High Command, in a fit of strategic desperation, resorted to launching V-1 flying bombs at the Allied port of Antwerp later in the campaign, hoping to cripple the supply hub itself. But this was a clumsy, inaccurate terror weapon, not a precision tool. It was the desperate act of an army that could no longer fight its enemy on the battlefield and was now reduced to lobbing bombs from afar, a tacit admission that they had lost control of the war in France. For the common German soldier, the Lanzer, this period was a descent into a special kind of hell. The psychological impact was devastating. In Russia, he had faced overwhelming numbers, but he could always cling to the belief in his own qualitative superiority. The Russian soldier was brave, but, in his view, unsophisticated. The American was something entirely new and terrifying. He was both numerous and highly skilled. He was endlessly supplied and displayed unnerving individual initiative. The German soldier's faith in his leadership and the propaganda he had been fed for a decade was systematically dismantled with every encounter. He would be told a new wonder weapon was coming to turn the tide, but on the ground, all he saw were more Sherman tanks, more P-47 seconds, and more well-fed, well-armed American infantrymen. Morale began to crumble, not in a single, dramatic collapse, but through a slow, corrosive process of exhaustion and disillusionment. A profound sense of futility took hold. Why clear a hedgerow when the Americans would simply pound the next one with artillery before their infantry advanced? Why shoot down a fighter plane when 5 more would appear to take its place? Why destroy a tank when the enemy seemed to have an infinite supply? He was a soldier in a dwindling, resource-starved army, fighting an enemy who treated ammunition like it was water and equipment like it was disposable. Letters captured from German soldiers during this period are filled with a sense of awe and despair. They wrote about the sheer amount of things the Americans possessed. They described prisoners who were given cigarettes and chocolate, luxuries most German troops hadn't seen in months. They found discarded American rations and were stunned by the quality canned meat, real coffee, crackers, and candy. To a man subsisting on black bread and thin soup, this was not just food, it was a psychological weapon. It spoke of a nation so rich, so powerful, that it could afford to provide its frontline soldiers with a standard of living higher than that of a civilian back in Germany. This was the true meaning of material Schlacht, a war of material that his own country could not hope to win. The German soldier had been taught he was a warrior of a master race, but he came to the crushing realization that he was a poor, ragged mechanic trying to fight a fully automated, state-of-the-art factory. The rumbling of the Red Ball Express in the distance was not just the sound of trucks, it was the sound of his own world unraveling. The final verdict on the German war effort in the West was not delivered in a single, climactic battle, but in the slow, dawning horror of 1,000 revelations. The German soldier was ultimately defeated not by a superior weapon or a cleverer general, but by a superior system. A system that was the direct reflection of the American society that created it. The Third Reich's ideology was built upon the myth of the Superman, the Übermensch. It preached that a society forged in discipline, racial purity, and unwavering obedience to a central will could produce a warrior so superior that he could overcome any material disadvantage. For a time, in the early years of the war, this seemed true. The Blitzkrieg was a triumph of this philosophy. A highly professional, centrally controlled military machine executing a perfect plan. But its strength was also its greatest weakness. It was rigid, brittle, and incapable of adapting when the perfect plan met an imperfect, chaotic reality. The American system, by contrast, was built on the ethos of the common man. It was a messy, decentralized, and often inefficient democracy. But it produced a military that was imbued with its core characteristics: flexibility, ingenuity, and a belief in the power of individual initiative. The German High Command could never comprehend how a nation of individualists could field such a cohesive and devastatingly effective army. They were stunned to realize that the American strength came from its individualism, not in spite of it. The ranger scaling the cliff, the paratrooper fighting alone in the dark, the engineer improvising a bridge under fire. These were not cogs in a machine. They were empowered problem solvers. The American military didn't just give its soldiers orders, it gave them objectives and trusted them to find a way to achieve them. This was a moral and philosophical victory as much as a military one. It was the triumph of a system that believed in the potential of millions of ordinary people over one that believed in the genius of a select few. The endless stream of material was merely the physical manifestation of this deeper truth. The factories in Detroit and the shipyards in California were not just producing tanks and planes, they were weaponizing the very concept of a free and open society, and the result was an avalanche of power that no army on earth could withstand. The ultimate demonstration of this new reality, the moment the German army in France was not just defeated but systematically annihilated, was Operation Cobra. By late July 1944, the fighting in Normandy had devolved into a brutal stalemate in the hedgerow country. The Germans, masters of defense, were bleeding the Allies for every yard of ground. It was a fight they understood. A war of attrition where their superior experience could tell. They began to believe they had contained the invasion. And then, on the morning of July 25th, the sky fell in. From the perspective of the German soldiers of the Panzer Division holding the line near Saint-Lô, it was the apocalypse. Over 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, followed by hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers, flew over a tiny 7-square-mile corridor of the front. For 3 hours they dropped tens of thousands of bombs, not on a city, but on a live, active military front. It was not an attack, it was an act of geological change. The earth bucked and heaved. Entire sections of the German line simply vanished, the men and their equipment vaporized, buried, or driven stark raving mad by the sheer, unending concussion. Command and control ceased to exist. It was the industrial sledgehammer, wielded with a terrifying, impersonal fury. The Germans never knew an army could use its strategic air force as a tactical battering ram. It was a violation of every military convention they knew. And then, through the smoke and dust of this man-made hell, came the scalpels. General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army poured through the gap. This was not the slow grind of the hedgerows. This was Blitzkrieg, perfected and amplified by American industrial power. Armored columns raced into the French interior, bypassing strongpoints, severing communication lines, and spreading chaos deep in the German rear. The German High Command was paralyzed. Their response when it finally came, was a desperate counterattack at Mortain. A textbook armoured thrust. It was exactly what the Allies were waiting for. Allied intelligence read the German orders, and the Jabos were unleashed. RAF Typhoons and US AAF P-47 Thunderbolts swarmed the skies, turning the German panzer columns into a burning scrapyard. It was a slaughter. What followed was the encirclement of the German 7th Army in the Falaise pocket. Trapped in a contracting ring of steel, pounded relentlessly by artillery and air power, the pride of the Wehrmacht in France was utterly destroyed. For the men caught in that pocket, the experience was a vision of damnation, a final, conclusive proof that their courage, their skill, and their ideology meant nothing in the face of this new American god of war. In the end, the story of the German defender in 1944 is a tragedy of disbelief. It began with a lieutenant on a cliff at Pointe du Hoc, who laughed at the absurdity of men trying to climb a rope under fire. His laugh was the sound of a worldview that was about to be shattered. He believed he was a superior warrior, a product of a master race, facing a decadent amateur. He was prepared for an enemy who would fight according to the established rules of warfare. He couldn't believe he was facing an enemy who brought the assembly line to the front line, who valued the initiative of a private as much as the plan of a general, and who saw an impossible 100-foot cliff, not as an obstacle, but as a challenge to be overcome. The German war machine was a finely crafted, beautiful, but ultimately fragile clockwork instrument. It was designed for a predictable world. The American way of war was a force of nature. It was a storm, chaotic and unpredictable, but driven by an irresistible internal energy. The German soldier was taught that he was the hero of a grand historical epic. The final, crushing verdict of the war in the West was that he was merely a temporary obstacle in the path of a system of industry, of ingenuity, and of individual freedom that was destined to inherit the future. The last thing he heard was not a heroic trumpet charge, but the distant, unending rumble of trucks on a highway, a sound that promised him nothing but a slow, grinding, and absolute defeat.